Established in 1960 by Fort Worth native William Edrington Scott, the Scott Foundation has a long and rich history with the Modern Art Museum here in Fort Worth. In 1965, the Scott Theater was completed adjacent to the then Fort Worth Art Center and former home of the Modern, and served as a cornerstone and advocate for the Royal Renowned Cultural District here in Fort Worth. Billy Scott's relation with the Modern goes further back to its earliest years and his close relationship with a group of Fort Worth artists known as the Fort Worth Circle. Scott collected their works, among others, for many years. The first official act of the Scott Foundation was to donate his art collection to the museum. Fort Worth's artistic legacy is beyond compare, and we are honored to be a part of it. Scott Foundation is proud to be the premier sponsor of the Modern's 125th anniversary documentary, celebrating all the museum has given to Fort Worth over the course of its lifetime. The friendship we share with the Modern is one we value deeply, and together we look forward to serving the city and the community we both treasure for generations to come.
This was a town of 300 to 500 people, and the economy was beginning to grow. But of course, all that was devastated in the aftermath of the Civil War. So then we end up with this decade of the trail driving period. And, imagine, again, you're sitting out on this bald, open prairie, you're trying to sit down at breakfast in your small house in the immediate vicinity of downtown, because everything kind of surrounded the courthouse initially. And all of a sudden, this herd of 12 or 1,500 animals come barreling through, and they're noisy, and they're dusty, and they're dirty, and everything in town stops. So, you can see that someone who wants to keep a house clean and tidy is going to do anything to mitigate just the dust and the noise and the rough and tumble of a town on the frontier. This was the western edge of the United States. And there was very little out here. The first, I think, civilizing thing that happened was the local doctor brought in a piano. And there's stories, if you can picture this area, there are very few houses, nothing but open prairie land. And what the sound of a piano in the midst of all of that silence in nature must have sounded like.
The exhibit upstairs is about the history of the Modern Art Museum from its beginnings in a gallery in the Carnegie Fort Worth Library to where it is now. In 1892, Mrs. Charles Schuber and a group of other women she was friends with met at her house on Taylor Street, and the purpose of the meeting was to establish a library and art gallery. I don't know the background of a lot of the women, but I suspect that most of them had spent time in large cities in the East and also in Europe, and they had ideas of what culture would be like and what they wanted Fort Worth to become. The women met at Mrs. Schuber's house for the goal of establishing a free public library and art gallery. And the reason they wanted to do this is because For a town to have culture, it needs to have a library so people have access to information, but it also needs to provide access to art.
Of course, what was happening at the same time was this concept of philanthropy really being invented by Andrew Carnegie. Made an enormous fortune. But this word went out around the country that, here's an opportunity for organizations that already have the vision but don't have the resources to jumpstart, again, what goes to the heart of the educational foundation of a city, and that's a public library. And when the opportunity for the Carnegie money comes along, we've got them sitting down and just saying, we're going to have one in Fort Worth.
The women of Fort Worth got together and solicited funds to purchase their first important work, which was Approaching Storm by George Ennis in 1904.
How do we make the town grow? How do we secure a place, where it's, life is tough. And history is full of little towns that got started that just didn't make it. So that goal is to create, the roots and the things that tie a city together that help it grow and develop, and make people want to stay, and then make people want to come. And it was out of that move, from let's bring music, let's bring culture. The next logical step is what you do with art and with learning. And the library and the original art gallery concept, spring directly out of that desire to clean the city up. But by the end of the 90s, we end up with an entirely different city than the beginning of the period. And then, of course, right after the turn of the century, Fort Worth's population and economy just skyrocketing in that first decade of the 20th century. So, at the time, they're getting started, we're still making that move off of the frontier. But by the end of the next decade, we're an entirely different city, kind of a modern metropolis. It's quite a transition.
There's a wonderful quotation from Jenny Schuber, Mrs. Schuber, who was the librarian at the Carnegie Library in Fort Worth, where the Fort Worth Art Association showed their works of art. And in a way, if you look back to correspondence of hers, she makes a number of comments in letters that indicate what the mission of the museum is. And in many ways, it really is still part of the museum today, the idea of it. In one letter, when she's writing to a Pennsylvania artist, Edward Redfield, whose work she would like to acquire the Art Association would like to acquire, the Redfield is priced too high, 3 times what they have available to acquire something. And she writes to Redfield saying that they love his painting, and it's not due to our lack of appreciation of the picture and its value, but due to the extreme difficulty of procuring any considerable sum of money for pictures in this new country, which has not inherited anything and whose people are engaged in the work of carving a city out of the raw prairie. She goes on to say that the Fort Worth Art Association is a little outpost which is doing missionary work and preaching the gospel of art.
Jenny Schuber passed away in 1944, which was 10 years before the Fort Worth Art Association separated from the Fort Worth Library. Mrs. Schuber and the women she worked with were able to create a lasting entity in Fort Worth. Without the Fort Worth Library and the Fort Worth Art Association, we would not have the wonderful appreciation of art that we do in Fort Worth today.
It opened in 1954. Herbert Bayer was an Austrian-born, extraordinarily talented individual who was known as a architect, as a designer of installations and exhibitions. He studied at the Bauhaus in Germany, which was the great institution for art at the time. Very progressive, very modern. And then in 1953, he was invited to become a design consultant for the new building of the Modern, which was a project coming out of a bond election or passing of a bond by the citizens of Fort Worth to build this new art museum. It would have been a very unusual building in Fort Worth at the time. And it was a standalone building. It originally was to have an auditorium wing, but they didn't have sufficient funds. And that's built in the 60s. The Scott Theater comes later. But Bayer was brought in, I think, specifically because of his modernist background. And he's credited with carrying out this modernist design of the building.
And the first thing, in 53, with again, that first bond issue that funded the art museum as well as the children's museum. That was the beginning of this remarkable collection that we call the Cultural District. And every museum has participated in it. Every museum has felt the obligation to maintain, I think, the level of architectural art as it has grown and developed. So, it's unique in the country. We've done something in Fort Worth that nobody else has done, and that's create a complex of museums that not only house art, they are art.
Ando represented a synthesis of a Japanese sensibility with modern aesthetics in their pure and most abstract form. Ando fits into the schema of architects who prize the essence of material and clear, elegant construction process. People have been following his work in Japan, and it had generated a great deal of interest. And this interest had come about largely through his use of concrete, glass, and steel, which he himself has described as the three major materials of modern architecture in the 20th century. With the commission of the Modern Museum of Fort Worth, that was really the first opportunity for Ando to make a large statement in the United States. The new museum was instantly a player on the national and international scene. It's certainly among the best museums built in the last 20 years internationally, without a doubt.
It's a nice play between natural light and artificial light. There's a sense in some ways that there's more natural light than there is. And I think that comes through when you walk in the building. And it's a wonderful entry, I think, because even before you're in the building, you can see into it and you can see beyond it. You can see the pond. So you have a kind of progression and anticipation of what's going to happen. It's a building that is incredibly impressive, but it's a building, I think, unlike some postmodern architectural structures in museums that have been very spectacular. That spectacle oftentimes overwhelms what it's doing on the inside, showing works of art. The Modern never does that. It's a building that you're aware of, but you're not being, your awareness is not one of distraction from looking at the art. If anything, you're aware that this building is framing artwork in a wonderful way, in a way that makes it very accessible to you and is giving you moments where you can contemplate works of art.
But interestingly, Ando took this opportunity not to promote himself, as many architects did and still do, but to create an extraordinary series of spaces where the art really thrives. Art and people thrive. What Ando intended was that the entire site would be animated and trees would be added and the grounds outside and the sculpture and so forth would become a place for the community. This sense of neighborhood and community, which the object of the building doesn't speak about directly, but only indirectly, apparently is part of his whole agenda. The current excitement about technology and artificial intelligence being the determinants of architecture, this enthusiasm will ebb and flow. And in the end, I think we'll look at a building like the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth and see it as a classic. It's going to stay, and its value will only increase in time, not decrease. And you can't say that about every building.
When I come here, the high ceilings, the work being spaced apart, it gives this level of importance to all the work that you're looking at that I don't think that all art spaces have. It's asking you to take time with work, and there's a level of seriousness that architecture provides.
I was fortunate enough to have a show here in this beautiful space, and it was one of the biggest things in my career. I've been always so proud of this place and watched everything that's happened here. To be a part of that was enormous. Lots of shows that originate here open in New York, open at the Met, open at the Whitney. So everybody's well aware of this place. It brings to the area for artists examples of things that are going on around the world. The things that are usually shown here are things of artists that have been around for a while, and it's been written and proven. Things have been more proven in time tested. And you get the benefit of lots of curating, careful curating of not only what artists, but what pieces and what parts of that artist's work that they want to show. Painters like, I mentioned Boslitz, the Boslitz paintings. That guy's just an amazing figurative painter in an abstract expressionist style. A group of paintings like that are just, when you first see those, wow, how great is that? You can go to Germany and see some paintings here and there, but not all of them put together like that. And then the Freud show, Lucian Freud show, is a classic painting, classic English painting. The Philip Guston show, another completely different way of all figurative paintings. So for a figurative painter, that was really great to see that. I just think it's awesome that the museum is like a lending library to shows everywhere, and that also lets you know that people all over the place are interested in what you're doing here and the kind of shows that you're having, that they want that show. I want that show to travel to the Met, or I want that show to travel to the Whitney. The museum is like a good teacher. I would have loved a teacher who said, okay, we're not going to have any tests. We're not going to ask you to come up in front of the class. I'm not going to get you to read anything to the class. I'm not going to get you to, spit anything back at me that I tell you. But I'm going to tell you a bunch of really cool stuff. Tell you a bunch of very interesting things about some very interesting people. And I would have loved a teacher like that, and that's what the museum does.
So if you would, please join me in welcoming Annette Lawrence.
I had the help of a friend, Eric Goodlett, who's here tonight.
The museum showed me what it was like really to be an artist. not only through the community that I was able to build with other young artists in the program, but also in terms of mentorship from the artists that the museum employs. Without the Modern, I wouldn't have known that the art life is possible.
It's not a vacuum. Artists can sit in their studios all day and make the greatest things, but unless they're Henry Darger and unless they're dead, it's like no one's gonna value that input because it's not connected to the rest of the world. And if you're making art that ignores everything around you in the hope of like creating something novel, that novel thing still has to exist in the community that you share it with.
Communities help each other. There hasn't been any progress made outside of community. You know, there's always a group of artists, a group of curators, a group of art historians who are kind of working in tandem to determine what the most important work of the day is, or to just whatever they're basically interested in is what becomes the most important work of the day. And it's hard to know what that's going to be. Like what's gonna last the longest is you can't know that in the moment. You just have to wait and see what happens, you know. So while you're doing it, you just kind of, you know, give it everything.
I think that's, call it an evening.
All right, thank you so much.
Well, you know, art is, you know, it's the reflection of history. You know, when we look at a period before photography, how do we view the world? You know, we view it through the artist's eyes.
It becomes history, you know. I think yes, it's the way we know the human story is through art, through, you know, whether it's visual arts or film or literature or music, theater, dance. I mean, that's how we know who we are.
I think art is not only history, but art also is a mapping of a culture. Art is so often related to cultural events, and I think the art being made right now pinpoints exactly where we are and what our culture's going through.
If all the art on the planet disappeared today, it would make for a really crappy planet. There's something about expressing yourself or reaching out to communicate with others that fights against the cold insignificance of floating in space as space dust and trying to make sense of who we are.
We're spelling out ideas and putting them down in a way with materials in response to certain ideas or thoughts that we have. Museums are stewards of our culture because they go through all the art that's being made and they tell us what's important to pay attention to.
We can have works from the 1950s, abstract expressionist works, like the Jackson Pollock in our collection, for example. And then pop art works. We have Warhol, we have an amazing painting by Roy Lichtenstein. You know, these works are a slice of the history and culture from the decade, from the time they were made. And so our institution, one of the aims of the permanent collection is kind of to tell that story visually, post-war to the present. So what's interesting to me when it comes to working with the permanent collection is helping people make that connection visually.
Museums are incubators of ideas, and they also foster artists. They foster artists not only through relationships with curators, but also young artists who are coming.
Art and art museums really collapse time. That you're able to see this thing that was made in the 40s next to this thing that was made in 2017. And to see the way these two objects communicate to each other and can exist in the same space is really incredible.
There are these storehouses of monumental, important work that's been made about our culture and through our time and through previous culture and time, and, you know, a place to be quiet and reflect and think.
It's really hard right now to convince people that seeing something on a screen is very different than going there in person. As technology is changing, there's also a need and a want for people to slow down. I think there's also so much right now about people designing their own experiences. And that can get a little murky because you don't know what you don't know.
Even if you can see it on a computer screen or in a book, it's, you know, it's ink dots and pixels versus a physical, because there are a lot of physical things about being in the presence of a work of art that are a lot more nuanced than the highest resolution image.
Museums can offer this thing that immediately challenges the speed of modern life.
There's something more in the presence of a thing than seeing volumes of that thing and scrolling through it or scanning it.
So, seeing the photographs that are in my show as opposed to having the book means that you're seeing them in their ideal form.
It's what artists want audiences, it's the experience artists that want audiences to have. You know, we don't make work so that you can look at it in a book. The real exchange is with the actual work.
Seeing works firsthand when possible. You know, it's not possible for everyone, and that's why we're so lucky in this city, because if you're studying art history near here, you can come and see works of art firsthand. But I don't know, there are certain works in the collection like the Teresita Fernandez. It's meant to be an immersive installation, and it's made with tiny chunks of graphite. And if you see it in an image reproduced or online, you do get a certain impression that it's maybe a dark storm cloud. But if you're standing in front of it, you really feel that these tiny minimal marks all come together to make this very dramatic storm cloud.
In an age of so much content and so much available at our fingertips all the time, I think the role of the museum is even more important. I mean, here's an institution that is saying, stop, have a moment with this thing.
If there were no people to see it, a museum would be a storage unit.
It's a storage unit without the people. Yeah.
It'd be a storage building. I mean, you don't have art without people.
Museums are storage units without visitors. Art doesn't exist without people seeing these things.
That would be so sad. So if no one visits a museum, then it's just someone's personal project, right? Or personal collection. A museum has to have a community that it's ministering to, that it's, you know, sharing with and creating dialogue with. And fostering ideas for. If no one comes to a museum, the museum has no purpose.
Personally, I don't think we'd have been fine without it. Because going back to that, idea of taming the frontier, softening the rough edges, you do that with art. And it's kind of hard to imagine any city moving forward from small community to major metropolitan area without art. And that always comes in the form of a museum, of a gallery, of some place where the community can gather to share the sense of art.
Yeah, what would the world or the community be like without a museum is the same way the community would look like without books, music, the sound of another person's voice. One of the ways that we express our humanness is by contemplating the world and explaining the world back to each other. In that way, having a place to go and look at the way other humans look at the world is the value that a museum has, or a gallery has, or the value that art has.
For so many people, art can be seen as frivolous, as unnecessary. When we talk about budget cuts in schools or higher education, the first thing to go are typically going to be the aesthetic programs. I think that's a mistake. The cities that choose to support their museums and support their artists, are the ones that are just that step above. There's a little, I think, broader vision for what the future can hold. And you don't ever want to let go of that. Everybody's going to have streets and sewer issues to deal with, and police and fire and all of the kind of routine, mundane, urban issues. What sets a city apart is what they look like, what they look at, what they propose as public art, how they design the city. So it goes to the very heart of what sets a city apart. And it's what we put on the walls of our houses, how we decorate the highways and the roadways and our public parks. It means we don't have to do this, we choose to do this.